Prisons are supposed to be the safest place to contain society's most dangerous criminals. High walls, steel bars, constant surveillance, armed guards, and maximum security cells, all designed to make escape impossible. But what if I told you there exists a man who has not only challenged these systems, but has terrified even the toughest prison in America? A man whose name is whispered with fear among inmates, whose presence makes guards uneasy, and whose violent reputation has earned him a place in the world's most secure facility. This man is Richard Lee, a prisoner so dangerous, so cunning, and so manipulative that he has become a living nightmare for the U.S. prison system. Born in 1975 in a small town in Georgia, Richard Lee seemed destined for trouble from the very beginning. His childhood was marked by neglect, abuse, and uncontrollable rage. Teachers described him as a disruptive student, quick to anger, and constantly defying authority. By the time most kids his age were learning how to drive, Richard was already well acquainted with the inside of a jail cell. Petty theft, assaults, and violent outbursts filled his teenage years, painting a dark picture of what was to come. But Richard Lee wasn't just another troubled youth. There was something far more sinister brewing inside him, a complete lack of empathy, an obsession with control, and an almost predatory instinct to manipulate those around him. And at just 18 years old, this darkness exploded in the form of a crime so brutal that it shocked the entire community. In 1993, after a heated argument with a local store owner, Richard snapped. Armed with a knife, he viciously attacked the man, leaving him to die in a pool of blood. Witnesses and investigators described the crime scene as horrifying, not just because of the violence, but because of the cold, calculated way Richard carried it out. There was no remorse, no hesitation, no panic. Just a chilling calmness, as though the murder was nothing more than routine. The justice system wasted no time. Richard Lee was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. For most criminals, this would be the end of the story. Life behind bars, punishment for a life taken. But for Richard Lee, it was only the beginning. Once inside prison, instead of being broken by the system, he thrived in it. He quickly built a reputation as a manipulator, a fighter, and a man who feared nothing. Fellow inmates either followed him out of fear or avoided him completely. Guards dreaded crossing paths with him, knowing his unpredictable nature could turn deadly in an instant. Richard was not just serving time. He was building his legacy as one of the most dangerous prisoners the United States had ever seen. But what made him truly terrifying was not just his violence. It was his mind. Richard Lee became obsessed with one thing: escape. He believed no prison could hold him, no guard could control him, and no system could tame him. Over the years, he planned and executed multiple escape attempts, each more elaborate and dangerous than the last. In 2001, he came frighteningly close to success, nearly breaking free from a maximum security facility before being caught at the last moment. To this day, Richard Lee remains locked away inside ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America, a fortress designed to house terrorists, cartel leaders, and the most dangerous killers in the world. Yet even here, prison officials admit that Richard is different. His manipulative nature, his history of violence, and his obsession with freedom make him a constant threat, a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. So who is Richard Lee really? A victim of a broken childhood or a natural-born predator destined for chaos? Is he just another violent criminal? Or is he truly the most dangerous prisoner alive? Join us as we dive deep into the chilling story of Richard Lee, the escape artist who terrifies America's toughest prison. Richard Lee's story begins long before his first violent crime, in a childhood environment that almost seemed designed to create chaos. Born in 1975 in a quiet town in Georgia, his early life was far from normal. While many children grew up surrounded by care, discipline, and guidance, Richard's world was filled with neglect, abuse, and instability. His parents were described as emotionally detached, often leaving him to fend for himself. His father was a violent man with a quick temper, and his mother, overwhelmed and distant, rarely intervened. From a very young age, Richard learned that anger and aggression were tools of survival. Teachers in elementary school noticed something unsettling about him. He wasn't just disruptive, he seemed to enjoy watching others suffer. Classmates recalled how he would pick fights, steal their belongings, and even hurt animals in moments of rage. This wasn't simple misbehavior. It was a glimpse into a darker, more dangerous side of his personality. By the time he entered his teenage years, Richard was already on the radar of local police. Arrests for petty theft, vandalism, and assault became regular occurrences. Unlike other juveniles who showed signs of regret after being caught, Richard was different. Officers reported that he often laughed during interrogations, as though being in trouble was nothing more than a game to him. Each arrest only seemed to embolden him, making him believe he was untouchable. It wasn't long before his criminal behavior escalated. At 15, he was arrested for violently assaulting a classmate during an argument. The boy survived, but the attack was so brutal that Richard was briefly placed in a juvenile detention center. Instead of rehabilitation, his time there only made him more dangerous. Inside, Richard learned how to manipulate, intimidate, and establish dominance. Other young offenders feared him, while staff members struggled to control his unpredictable outbursts. Psychologists who later studied his behavior suggested that Richard Lee displayed early signs of antisocial personality disorder. This meant he lacked empathy, had little regard for rules, and thrived on manipulating others for personal gain. Combined with a childhood of abuse and neglect, these traits created a recipe for disaster. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of his youth was the complete absence of remorse. Teachers, counselors, and law enforcement all noticed that Richard never expressed guilt for his actions. If anything, he seemed to enjoy the chaos he caused. He wasn't just acting out. He was testing limits, pushing boundaries, and feeding an inner hunger for control. As he grew older, his crimes became more calculated. No longer satisfied with petty theft or schoolyard fights, Richard began targeting local businesses. He would intimidate shop owners, threaten employees, and steal with a level of boldness that shocked even seasoned officers. It was as if he wanted to prove he was above the law, daring anyone to stop him. By 18, Richard's reputation in his hometown was cemented. He wasn't just a troubled teen anymore. He was becoming a dangerous young man. Police officers privately admitted that they feared what he might do if his violent tendencies continued unchecked. Unfortunately, their fears would soon be realized in the most horrifying way. In 1993, the crime that would define Richard Lee's future unfolded. After a heated confrontation with a local store owner, Richard snapped in a way that revealed the full extent of his brutality. Armed with a knife, he launched a vicious attack, stabbing the man repeatedly and leaving him to die in cold blood. Witnesses who saw Richard fleeing the scene described him as calm, almost expressionless, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. For investigators, the murder was shocking not just because of the violence but because of the motive. Or rather, the lack of one. This wasn't a crime of passion, nor was it a desperate attempt to steal. It was cold, calculated, and ruthless. Richard had crossed a line from delinquent to murderer, and there was no going back. The small town of Georgia was shaken to its core. For years, people had whispered about Richard's dangerous behavior, but few believed it would ever lead to murder. Now, the community was left reeling, wondering how a young man could descend into such darkness so quickly. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and Richard's lack of remorse only made things worse. When asked if he felt guilty for taking a man's life, Richard reportedly smirked and shrugged. That chilling reaction left jurors and court officials stunned. Within weeks, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But what no one realized at the time was that Richard Lee's story was only beginning. the sentence meant to cage him for life, would instead serve as the stage for his most terrifying acts yet. Prison wasn't going to contain him. It was going to transform him into something far worse. When Richard Lee entered prison, many believed his violent tendencies would finally be contained. Life behind thick concrete walls, razor wire fences, and constant surveillance was supposed to break him down. For most inmates, prison was a place of punishment, where fear of authority and the weight of a life sentence eventually forced compliance. But Richard Lee was not most inmates. Instead of being tamed, he grew stronger, more dangerous, and far more unpredictable. From his very first day behind bars, Richard made it clear that he would not be controlled. Guards quickly noticed his piercing stare, his calm but menacing demeanor, and his ability to size up a situation within seconds. Unlike other prisoners who arrived broken or anxious, Richard seemed almost comfortable, as though the prison environment suited him. To him, prison wasn't a cage. It was a hunting ground. Within weeks, Richard had already established a reputation among fellow inmates. He was violent when challenged, manipulative when it served his purpose, and fearless in the face of authority. His cellmates described him as cold and calculating, someone who could switch from charm to violence in an instant. Weak inmates avoided him, while others gravitated toward his leadership, terrified of what would happen if they didn't. One of Richard's most chilling traits was his ability to manipulate others into doing his bidding. He didn't always use brute force. Instead, he preyed on vulnerabilities. He would study people, learn their weaknesses, and exploit them for his advantage. Prison psychologists noted that he had an almost predatory instinct, treating fellow inmates like pawns in a game he was determined to win. For prison guards, Richard was a nightmare. He assaulted officers on multiple occasions, often without warning. One guard recalled an incident where Richard attacked with such precision and speed that it seemed premeditated. Yet, despite the violence, Richard always maintained a terrifying sense of control. He didn't lash out blindly. He calculated every move, making it clear that his assaults were never random. They were messages, warnings, and demonstrations of power. Over time, the prison staff realized that typical disciplinary measures had little effect on him. Solitary confinement, a punishment that broke many inmates, only seemed to fuel his obsession with control. In fact, some officers reported that Richard appeared more focused and dangerous after long stretches in isolation, as though solitude gave him time to plan his next move. Other inmates soon began whispering about Richard's growing influence. Stories circulated about how he orchestrated fights, manipulated trades, and controlled contraband from inside his cell. Even prisoners housed in different blocks seemed to fall under his influence, showing just how far his reach extended. He wasn't just surviving prison life, he was dominating it. What made Richard especially terrifying was his unpredictability. There were days when he seemed calm, collected, and even polite. Guards would describe brief interactions where he appeared cooperative, sometimes even helpful. But beneath the surface, everyone knew it was an act. Richard was always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. His calmness was a mask, hiding the storm that could erupt at any second. Prison records over the years painted a disturbing picture. Dozens of violent incidents involving Richard, including brutal assaults on both inmates and staff. Medical reports documented broken bones, deep cuts, and psychological trauma inflicted on those unfortunate enough to cross his path. Each incident reinforced the same chilling truth. Richard Lee was not a man who could be controlled by walls, bars, or authority. Even more troubling was the effect he had on prison staff themselves. Many guards admitted, off the record, that they were uneasy working near him. Unlike other dangerous inmates, who could often be predicted by their tempers or gang affiliations, Richard was different. He was patient, intelligent, and manipulative. Guards feared that any sign of weakness, a friendly gesture, a misplaced trust, could be exploited by him. Psychologists who studied Richard inside prison described him as a textbook predator. He wasn't simply reacting to his environment. He was shaping it, bending it to his will. His need for dominance, combined with his lack of empathy, made him one of the most dangerous individuals ever to step foot inside the facility. For the prison system, Richard Lee presented a unique challenge. He wasn't just another violent inmate who could be controlled with strict rules and punishment. He was something far more complex, a man who thrived on chaos, who fed on fear, and who seemed to grow more dangerous with each passing year. By the late 1990s, officials began to realize that Richard wasn't just a problem within the prison walls. He was a ticking time bomb. If he ever managed to escape, the consequences for society would be catastrophic. And that terrifying possibility became all too real when Richard turned his obsession toward one goal: breaking free. For most inmates, escape is nothing more than a fantasy. Whispered conversations in the yard, secret daydreams about life beyond the walls. But for Richard Lee, escape wasn't just a dream. It was an obsession, a mission that consumed his every waking thought. While other prisoners adapted to their sentences, Richard was already plotting, calculating, and exploiting every weakness in the prison system. His first attempt came only a few years into his sentence. It wasn't elaborate, just a crude effort to overpower a guard and slip past a security checkpoint. Predictably, it failed, but it revealed something crucial. Richard was willing to take extreme risks. Unlike others who feared harsher punishment, he didn't care about solitary confinement or losing privileges. For him, failure was just part of the process. Every attempt, whether successful or not, was a lesson, a chance to refine his methods for the future. By the late 1990s, Richard's escape attempts became more sophisticated. He studied guard routines, memorized shift changes, and manipulated fellow inmates into assisting him. Prison officials noted how he seemed to know more about the inner workings of the facility than some of the staff themselves. His intelligence, combined with his manipulative nature, made him a uniquely dangerous escape artist. But it was in 2001 that Richard orchestrated his most terrifying and nearly successful escape. The plan was bold, violent, and chillingly well thought out. Using smuggled contraband and the help of a few manipulated inmates, Richard managed to attack a guard during transport, seizing a weapon and creating chaos. For a brief moment, freedom was within his grasp. The prison went into full lockdown as alarms blared and officers scrambled to respond. Richard fought with a level of ferocity that shocked even seasoned correctional staff. Witnesses recalled the sheer determination in his eyes. Not panic, not desperation, but focus. He wasn't running wildly. He was moving with precision, following a plan he had rehearsed in his mind countless times. What stopped him was not a lack of preparation, but sheer bad luck. Just as he approached a secondary gate, reinforcements arrived. Outnumbered and cornered, Richard launched into a violent struggle, injuring multiple officers before finally being subdued. The aftermath left guards shaken, not just by the brutality of the attempt, but by how close he had come to escaping a maximum security facility. The incident made headlines across the United States. The idea that such a dangerous inmate could almost break free from one of the nation's most secure prisons sent shockwaves through the justice system. For the public, it was terrifying. What if Richard Lee had made it out? What would a man with his violent history do if unleashed on society again? After the 2001 attempt, security around Richard was tightened to unprecedented levels. He was moved to higher security units, placed under constant surveillance, and denied many of the privileges afforded to other inmates. Yet even then, prison officials admitted privately that they could never let their guard down. Richard's mind was always working, always scheming, always looking for another opportunity. What made him especially dangerous was his ability to manipulate others into helping him. Guards, fellow prisoners, even staff contractors. Richard knew how to exploit weaknesses, whether through intimidation, charm, or psychological pressure. In one documented case, he convinced another inmate to create a diversion that nearly allowed Richard to test the facility's perimeter defenses. Though the attempt failed, it once again proved his influence reached far beyond his own cell. To correctional officers, Richard's escape attempts became a symbol of fear. Unlike typical inmates who gave up after repeated failures, Richard only grew more determined. Each setback made him smarter. Each punishment only fueled his obsession. The question was no longer if he would try again, but when. By the early 2000s, it was clear. Richard Lee could not be contained by ordinary maximum security measures. He wasn't just an inmate anymore. He was a constant threat to the integrity of the prison system itself. Authorities knew that if he ever succeeded, the consequences would be catastrophic. And so, the decision was made. Richard Lee would be transferred to the one place in America designed specifically for prisoners like him, the infamous ADX Florence Supermax Prison in Colorado. A facility so secure, so isolating, and so unforgiving that escape was said to be impossible. But for prison officials, even ADX was not a guarantee. Because if anyone could challenge the most secure prison in America, it was Richard Lee. When Richard Lee was transferred to ADX Florence, it was meant to be the end of his reign of chaos. Known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX is the most secure federal prison in the United States, a fortress of concrete and steel built in the shadow of the Colorado mountains. This facility was designed specifically for men like Richard, individuals considered too dangerous, too violent, and too uncontrollable for even maximum security prisons. At ADX, freedom is reduced to the smallest fragments of existence. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, locked in cells no larger than a bathroom. Each cell is built with reinforced concrete, solid steel doors, and only a small window, angled so that inmates can see nothing but the sky. Contact with other humans is nearly non-existent. Meals are slid through slots, exercise is confined to small, caged yards, and conversations with other prisoners are limited to muffled voices through walls. For many inmates, this environment breaks the spirit. The crushing isolation, the silence, the absence of human contact. It erodes the mind and leaves men hollow. But for Richard Lee, ADX was not a punishment. It was a new battlefield. Guards and staff quickly realized that Richard remained as dangerous as ever. Isolation did not weaken him. If anything, it sharpened his focus. He treated ADX not as a cage, but as a challenge, an obstacle he was determined to overcome. Even within those cold concrete walls, he found ways to manipulate, intimidate, and assert control. Reports from inside ADX reveal disturbing incidents involving Richard. Despite having no direct access to other prisoners, he allegedly managed to send coded messages through the ventilation system, attempting to influence inmates he could not physically see. On other occasions, guards claimed he would study their every move, memorizing patrol patterns, eyeing security protocols, and making unnerving comments that showed just how closely he was paying attention. One correctional officer described Richard as the kind of inmate who never blinks. Even during routine checks, Richard would stare directly at guards, unflinching, as though daring them to look away first. That quiet, unsettling presence created an atmosphere of constant tension. Officers admitted privately that working around him was exhausting, because with Richard, every second felt like a standoff. But what made Richard truly frightening inside ADX was his ability to resist the psychological toll of isolation. Many prisoners fell into despair, some even losing touch with reality after years of solitary confinement. Richard, however, appeared unaffected. He maintained his sharpness, his focus, and his chilling sense of purpose. Psychologists concluded that his lack of empathy and emotional detachment made him almost immune to the mental collapse that others experienced. Where most men withered, Richard endured. Over the years, Richard also attempted to test the limits of ADX security. While no escape from Florence has ever succeeded, staff reported multiple incidents where Richard appeared to probe for weaknesses. Whether through tampering with cell fixtures, testing restraints, or manipulating staff into minor errors, he constantly pushed boundaries. To officials, he was a reminder that no system, no matter how secure, was truly foolproof. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his time in ADX is that Richard's influence extended beyond the walls of his cell. Through letters, coded notes, and manipulated contacts, he managed to reach the outside world. Investigations revealed that Richard attempted to communicate with individuals on the outside, feeding them instructions and plans. Though most of these efforts were intercepted, the very fact that he could establish such connections in a place as isolating as ADX sent chills through the prison system. Even now, years into his confinement, Richard Lee remains one of the prison's most closely monitored inmates. Guards operate under strict protocols when handling him, always moving in pairs, always wearing protective gear, and never underestimating his capacity for violence. Despite the high walls, the razor wire, and the endless surveillance, officials know one truth. If anyone can challenge ADX Florence, it's Richard Lee. For the prison staff, he has become a living nightmare, a reminder that some men cannot be tamed, no matter how deep you bury them. And for the world outside, his story raises an unsettling question. If Richard ever did find a way out, what kind of chaos would follow? The story of Richard Lee is more than just the tale of a violent man locked behind bars. It is a chilling reminder of the limits of the justice system and the terrifying potential of a mind that refuses to be contained. His legacy is not measured only by the crimes he committed, but by the fear he continues to inspire, both inside and outside prison walls. Psychologists who studied Richard argue that he represents the extreme end of human behavior, a man who lacks empathy, thrives on manipulation, and finds satisfaction in the suffering of others. Unlike most inmates, whose violence is born out of desperation, anger, or circumstance, Richard's violence is purposeful. It is a tool, a weapon, and a way to exert control. This makes him fundamentally different, and far more dangerous than the average criminal. One expert described him as a predator in a cage. That phrase captures the essence of Richard Lee's legacy. Even surrounded by concrete steel and endless surveillance, he is still a hunter, waiting for an opportunity to strike. His attempts to escape, his ability to manipulate others, and his refusal to submit to authority have made him a symbol of defiance against the prison system itself. For prison officials, Richard is a constant reminder that some men cannot be rehabilitated. The justice system is built on the belief that punishment and time can change individuals, steering them away from crime. But in Richard's case, prison only sharpened his instincts. Instead of softening him, confinement turned him into something even more dangerous. A man who views punishment as fuel for his obsession. Over the decades, Richard has become infamous among both inmates and staff. To fellow prisoners, he is a figure of fear and fascination. Stories about his manipulation and his near escapes circulate like legends, exaggerating his power and influence. To guards, he is a source of unease, a reminder that no matter how well-trained or well-prepared they are, Richard is always watching, always waiting for a mistake. The public, too, has not forgotten his name. News coverage of his 2001 escape attempt left an indelible mark on the American imagination. People across the country asked the same frightening question. What if he had made it out? What chaos would a man like Richard Lee unleash if given even a single day of freedom? That fear, though hypothetical, lingers to this day. Now confined in ADX Florence, the harshest prison in the United States, Richard's story is far from over. At 48 years old, he remains a threat, both to those around him and to the very system built to contain him. Prison officials know that as long as Richard Lee is alive, he will continue to plot, scheme, and test their defenses. And so, the question remains, What does the future hold for a man like Richard Lee? Will he spend the rest of his life locked in solitude, gradually fading into obscurity? Or will he one day find another opportunity, another crack in the system, another chance to remind the world of his terrifying capabilities? The truth is, no one knows. But one thing is certain. Richard Lee's legacy is already sealed. He is remembered not just as a murderer, but as one of the most dangerous prisoners in modern history. A man whose very presence exposes the fragility of the prison system, and whose story serves as a warning of the darkness that can exist within the human mind. In the end, Richard Lee is not just a prisoner. He is a symbol of violence, of manipulation, and of a chilling truth. Some men are beyond redemption, and as long as he remains alive, locked behind the walls of ADX Florence, Richard Lee will continue to embody the nightmare that prisons were never meant to face, a predator who cannot be caged,